news and market movers. This is The Pulse with Francine Lacqua.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to The Pulse. Happy Wednesday. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London. So traders will definitely scour the July Fed minutes today for hints on the end of QT in a meeting that took place days before the week jobs reports. Well, an annual review of U.S. jobs data is also due today. Let's get straight to our markets analyst, Maria Municchi, fund manager at Mgmt Investments. Maria, as always, thank you so much for joining us. What a week. We have Jay Powell. We're waiting what he has to say on Friday, and then we have all of this data looking at the minutes. Do you think that the markets are far ahead? They're expecting too many cuts, or they're too certain that we'll get a cut in September?
Well, it's certainly a very busy week and what has been already a very busy month around rates and rate expectations. And I think, there is a lot of focus on trying to understand not only where the Fed position is around the labor market, but where the labor market actually is today. And I think there is a lot of focus on single data. But unfortunately, when we look at the labor market, we have to have a broader picture of what are the different indicators that can tell us the full story. So what we're seeing so far is that there's certainly be a level of normalization in the job market, but there is some new dynamics that are following the pandemics that needs to be taken into account. And I think potentially what the market might look at into the Fed minutes and into Powell's speech later this week is really a little bit more of insight on what are they looking for within the labor market, what are the trends that they're observing at the moment, and that we will continue to follow, which will then dictate what the policy will be in terms of interest rates.
Maria, I feel like the market, again, was, going for a soft landing, and then there were worries about a recession, and now a lot of the big banks has gone back to this Goldilocks scenario. Again, is that too optimistic?
Well, I agree that we're back in a central scenario of soft lending, and there's been a very, very short period of time at the beginning of August in which we've entered a heightened risk of recession, and the talk about emergency cuts even before the September meeting, and that's very, very quickly been dissipated, and we've seen how equity markets have rebounded on the back of that. I think the way the curve has shifted in the US is very, very interesting. So obviously we had the short end of the curve starting to move much lower in terms of yields and pricing in quite significant amounts of cuts. I think at the moment, we've lightened up the position on the shorter end of the curve in the US. There is a little bit of vulnerability in the sense of, what will actually happen in terms of rate cuts in the coming months. But if we move further along the curve, so if we look at 10, but also in particular if we look at the 30 years, I think we're still at levels which are quite interesting, still just above the 4% yield mark, and also a curve that has been steepening in this latest phase, so that gives a little bit more of potential, again, on the longer end of that curve. And the other element that has been extremely interesting to observe has been, this renewed correlation and these diversification properties of the U.S. Treasuries in general in the long end in this risk-off phase. And that, from a multi-asset investment perspective, has been extremely interesting to observe, and, hopefully an interesting indicator of, what can we expect from here in different risk-off scenarios.
So what can we expect? Again, gold's moving, and I don't know how difficult. I mean, it feels impossible to actually see where we are in the unwinding of this carry trade. Will a lot depend on what BOJ does on where you put your money in terms of risk assets?
Yeah, extremely difficult and very opaque to understand exactly, the amount of money still present in the carry trade and how will this continue to unwind. Certainly, the dichotomy on the direction of the two central banks have been, quite an important pivot in this phase. But the extent to which this will continue to unwind is very difficult to predict. Certainly, there is still a very important interest rate differential, so there is, still benefit of maintaining that carry trade for some players in the market. But at the same time, potentially from a more fundamental standpoint over the longer term, you can see the two currencies moving, again, in opposite direction from what we've seen in the last couple of years. So I think what is interesting is what the implications might be from the equity market perspective in Japan. And what we've observed at the beginning of August was, in our view, very much an overreaction to the potential unwinding of this carry trade. We've seen, enormous volatility on the Japanese equity market, with pretty much no change from a fundamental perspective. Yes, a slight different direction from a policy standpoint, but nothing groundbreaking in that regard. And even in terms of the sizing of the moves on interest rates, And so I think in this phase that has represented an interesting opportunity from a tactical standpoint to enter into Japanese equity markets as well as Korean equity markets, which has also sold off significantly together with Japan. And we've seen already quite a significant rebound in these markets, after this very strong volatility of the beginning of August reversed.
Maria, are you constructive on anything in Europe? If you look at UK assets or European assets, again, they're caught. I mean, we're also getting some possible retaliation on dairy products from China, and so Europe seems to be stuck in the middle.
Yeah, so I think Europe continues to be very attractive from a valuation standpoint compared to other equity markets. So in a medium to longer term sense, I think there is value there. There are companies that are very global in nature and that have exposure to very interesting sectors that could also do well on a cutting rate type of environment. So there is opportunity there for the medium to long term, especially in an environment of soft landing where you can continue to have this grinding growth on the background in a context of declining rates, which we've already started to see in Europe, where the current inflation backdrop really is continuing to be supportive for that to continue. It could always reverse, but the trends that we've been seeing on inflation data, it's been pretty robust so far and really moving towards normalization.
I imagine many clients are saying, like, what do I do with gold, but also do I go to cash?
Yes, I think cash in terms of the real yield that is offering still remains quite attractive. Especially if you compare that with some pockets of the equity market that might have moved quite excessively. I probably wouldn't have said this just a week ago when we were just after the sell-off, but things have moved really fast. And there are pockets of the equity market that might look a little bit vulnerable, if not so much on a valuation standpoint, but also because this valuation is relying very much on very strong earnings. And if you have some faltering on the earnings delivery, then you might have some disappointment on some areas of the market. So in this regard, cash in a diversified portfolio still remains quite an interesting asset to play with. However, if you start seeing the correlation across equities and fixed income playing out a little bit more, so for example, sovereign debt regaining this role of diversifying assets, then cash becomes all of a sudden a bit less appealing. But obviously this will be more robust in an environment of declining interest rates, and volatility is likely to still be there, as we have seen for the last few years on fixed income markets.
Yeah, and hopefully we'll have a little bit more of a glimpse into these declining interest rates at the end of the week with that Jay Powell speech. Maria, as always, thank you so much for joining us. That was Maria Municchi, fund manager. I can't speak, it's Wednesday. Fund manager at Mgmt Investments. Coming up, the obesity market has seen a massive boom in recent years. We'll be speaking to the chief executive of Zealand Pharma to find out what's behind the recent rise. That's next. And this is Bloomberg. Welcome back, everyone. Now, the obesity market has seen a bit of a boom in recent years, and Goldman Sachs actually predicts it will be worth $130 billion by the end of this decade. Well, one company looking to take advantage is Zealand Pharma. The Danish firm is currently the best performing stock on Eurostoxx 600 year to date, with its share price rising to some 250% over 12 months. Well, I'm delighted to be joined by Adam Steensberg. He is the chief executive of Zealand Pharma, and he joins us now for an exclusive conversation. Welcome to London. Welcome to the Pulse. Thank you so much for joining us, Adam. I mean, it's pretty incredible when you look at the stock price. It's been an incredible run since the beginning of the year. What do you think has happened to your company to attract all this attention?
I think there's no question. There's just a strong and very deep recognition that we have one of the most exciting obesity pipelines across the industry, and therefore also have a potential to become a key player in this growing market in the future.
So how far along are you in actually developing an obesity product that you will sell to consumers?
Yeah, so we actually have, you can say, 4 products in development. And the one we are most excited about is a novel kind of molecule called petrelintide, which could be, if everything goes well, on the market in 2029.
And again, what kind of, I mean, this revolutionizes, right, the way that we look at obesity. Because it lead to, do you know, do you have any forecast of the kind of market cap that could give you?
No, I mean, I don't speculate on that, but I would say we are extremely ambitious with the company. We think with petrelintide, and this, in particular with petrelintide, we really have the potential now to develop the first true alternative to the current, you can say, molecules that are being rolled out to patients. So, and with the profile that we have seen thus far, we also think it could form a future backbone in the management of obesity. So we are extremely ambitious on behalf of Zealand and the journey that we have in front of us now.
So how different is this molecule to what we have at the moment?
You know, I think if you look across both the first two molecules that have been approved and are being rolled out to patients today, and also a lot of the pipeline programs, most of them are built on a molecule called GLP-1, so leveraging the biology of that. We are leveraging the biology of a molecule called amylin, and you know, it works in a different way, where the GLP-1 class mostly work by reducing your appetite. Amylin works by introducing satiety. So those are two very different experiences. And I would also say the early clinical data that we have suggests that we have less side effects. So a lot of patients who get exposed to GLP-1 have nausea, vomiting. We don't see the same degree of nausea and vomiting with our molecule so far.
So if you're expecting this drug to actually be available, well, one of the four that you have in the pipeline by 2029, how big will the market be by then?
You know, it's so difficult to predict how big the market will be. I think what we have to recognize is that obesity and the obesity pandemic is probably the biggest healthcare challenge of our time. And therefore, you can say it also will be the biggest market for medicines in the future. So I think still most people underestimate how big it will become. And in our books, there will be many more patients on treatment than what most people expect, because it's not about obesity, it's about the consequences of living with obesity for a long time. So we think the market will be very, very large, because we have to address this. Otherwise, we'll have too much chronic diseases.
I mean, you're really seen as, you know, the potential big competitor to Novo Nordisk. Again, what would you say in terms of differences and what that means also in your country?
You know, both Novo Nordisk and Lilly, having launched the first, I can say, once-weekly product that can truly address the weight loss that people are looking for, they are focusing with the current rollout on creating this market. What we are focusing on is the next innovation, the wave, the medicines that could make a difference in the 30s.
So you must be a takeover target.
I don't think, I mean, that's not our strategy, at least. Our strategy is to continue to develop these medicines alongside a partner. So we will be out looking for the right partner who can help us get these patients through development and into, you can say, a broad use if approved. But, yeah.
Have you found a partner? Are you in talks to find a partner? And what kind of partner are you looking for?
Yeah, so we had some fantastic data readouts in June of this year, and we have been very kind of, you can say, open around the fact that after these data and also following a quite significant capital raise in June, we will be initiating partner discussions in this second half, and what we would be looking for is a large pharma company who will be as committed and have the same vision and ambition around petrelintide as we have, somebody we can work alongside in a co-development and co-commercialization partnership.
Does it matter if they're based in Europe? Would that make a difference compared to someone in the US or elsewhere?
No. I mean, for us, you know, the interactions we will have will be with some of the largest pharma companies of this world. The most important thing is they have a global reach and they would share our vision and ambition for petrelintide.
With the two big, companies that are doing some of these obesity drugs at the moment, Novo and Eli Lilly, have struggled with capacity. Do you think that continues?
You know, this will continue for some years, but I'm also very sure that when we approach the 30s, I mean, there will not be a capacity problem anymore. This is about investing in time. It takes time to build capacity. So you can say as long as you start to invest in time, there will be no capacity problems in the 30s, in my mind.
But so what happens to now until the 30s? I guess the concern is that, we have 6 years of maybe uncertainty.
Yeah, but I mean, I think everybody recognizes today that it's a supply-driven market today because there is shortage on drugs and manufacturing capacity, and that will remain an issue for some time, and that you can say, but the good news for Zealand is once we are ready to launch our medicines, I truly believe we will solve these issues. I
mean, pricing is a huge issue at the moment. Will yours be cheaper?
I mean, again, it's too early to comment on those things, but I can just reiterate that obesity is the biggest healthcare challenge that we are facing. So many more patients will have to be on treatment. We will also have to do other things in society to drive down the obesity pandemic. Ultimately, when you see volumes going up, I would also expect prices to go down.
Thank you so much for joining us today for a very, very interesting conversation. That was Adam Steensberg, the Chief Executive of Zealand Pharma. I have a feeling we'll hear about Zealand a lot more in the coming months and years. Coming up, we talk politics. Barack Obama headlines the second night of the Democratic National Convention as Kamala Harris leans on his campaign in the race for the White House. We have the full details next, and this is Bloomberg.
We do not need 4 more years of bluster and bumbling and chaos. We all know that the sequel is usually worse. America's ready for a better story. We are ready for a President Kamala Harris.
Barack Obama there headlining the second night of the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. Now, for more on this, let's bring in Bloomberg's Vonnie Quinn, who's in D.C. for us. Vonnie, interesting, really interesting. This is something that you pointed out, to see Harris bringing in veterans from the Obama White House and campaign. How much has the electorate actually changed in 16 years?
Well, the dynamics that were already happening when Barack Obama got first elected have just continued to happen, right? The whole of America is changing. It's getting more multicultural. It's getting more diverse religiously. It's changing in states as well. You know, state to state, we're seeing various dynamics happen. But what this team that got the first person of color elected to the White House will want to do is repeat that, right? So you're seeing David Plouffe get put on the Kamala Harris payroll. He ran the 2008 campaign. Also, Jennifer Palmieri, who is the communications director. These are names that we know very well, right? Because they were around D.C. for 8 years during the Obama presidency. What they will want to do is get that Obama coalition back, right? So particularly a reach out to black voters. Turnout among black voters has been decreasing. And while the actual proportion of registered black voters in the Democratic Party itself hasn't changed too much over the years, turnout has. They will want to reach out to those voters. Also, what Barack Obama did very well in 2008 was appeal to northern white voters, particularly uneducated voters. Kamala Harris will be looking to get that proportion of the population back as well. They overwhelmingly flipped to Donald Trump in 2016. So this is the coalition that this group of staffers that are now in the Harris campaign will be targeting very specifically. Those and, of course, suburban women and independent voters. But just to put a few figures on it, the Hispanic vote has more than tripled in the last 30 years, right? So now we're talking about 16% of registered Democrats are Hispanic. And then you also have the Asian vote as well. She's South Asian. She would be the first Asian in the Oval Office were she to be elected. That represents about 6% of the potential Democratic vote in terms of registered voters already.
Vonnie, is there a danger that actually Democrats become too complacent, especially at a time when the Trump campaign are now trying to brand themselves as the common sense option?
Exactly, trying to almost counteract the weird moniker that's been traveling around Democratic circles. There is, I think, Francine, and you saw that tonight, you saw Michelle Obama and Barack Obama really press home this idea that this is not going to be an easy election to win, and that they need to constantly and, you know, considerably make an effort between now and Election Day to get out that vote. I'll just quote for you Michelle Obama: "This is going to be an uphill battle. We need to vote in numbers that erase any doubt. We need to overwhelm any effort to suppress us." You're going to see this. Kamala Harris has said this as well.
Vonnie, thank you so much. Of course, looking at that very closely from Washington, D.C. live, Vonnie Quinn there. Coming up, as mpox spreads in Africa, the focus turns to securing enough vaccines on the continent to stop the outbreak. We'll be speaking to the Director General of the ECDC. This is Bloomberg. Good Good morning, everyone, and welcome to The Pulse. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London. These are your top stories. European stocks brush off declines in Asia as investors wait for an annual review of key U.S. jobs data and the Fed minutes for further clues on rate cuts. JD.com and other Chinese tech stocks fall after Walmart sells its stake in the e-commerce giant, raising about $3.6 billion and closing an 8-year partnership. Plus, Barack and Michelle Obama deliver blistering critiques of Donald Trump at the second night of the Democratic National Convention as nominee Kamala Harris looks to recapture the same political momentum from 2008. Now, on to mpox vaccines, and they're expected to arrive in Africa by the end of next week as a new strain spreads from the Democratic Republic of Congo. The Director General of Africa's CDC says stopping the continent's outbreak will save lives in the rest of the world.
The response we are talking about is led at national level by the minister, at regional level by the regional economic communities, and at continental level by Africa CDC, working with all partners.
Well, Bloomberg's chief Africa correspondent Jennifer Zabazaja joins us now. Jen, what more did we actually learn from authorities on Tuesday?
Well, Fran, authorities were really trying to use Tuesday to dispel any sort of concerns that have been surrounding mpox since it was declared a global health emergency. I mean, if we start with the WHO, we did hear an official say that, no, this new strain or the old strain, no, it is not the new COVID. But then just there you were hearing from the Africa CDC director who talked about the importance of not making the same mistakes that we did see with the COVID pandemic. And, of course, ensuring that Africans get vaccinated in order to support the fight against this disease more globally. And in particular, he did want to address and actually educate people about the response to this disease, which I thought was quite interesting. He said, I clearly request our partners to stop thinking about travel bans against Africa. That will bring us back to the unfair treatment from the COVID period and will not help the world move forward. So really a lot from authorities trying to get people on the same page about this.
Jen, do we have any indication about which vaccine manufacturers will be providing these doses?
Well, we've heard a bit from a number of vaccine manufacturers, Fran. We heard from Roche, which said that they did want to update their laboratories to, in fact, help with mpox testing capabilities. We also heard from Emergent, which has a smallpox vaccine, saying that they would be willing to donate their doses to the DRC. South Africa also has BioVac, which has also discussed plans. But maybe in particular, Bavarian Nordic has been speaking, from our understanding, with the Africa CDC. And they're the only ones, or one of the only ones, that have an approved mpox vaccine that could potentially fill the gap that is needed. But what's important to remember is that it's different to express interest and then to distribute. And also we have to think about the costs. And so a lot of authorities have been talking about just how expensive some of these vaccines are. And a lot of these are going to go to low and middle income countries. And so there might need to be some subsidizing happening. But not just that, there also potentially needs to be some insight into how logistically we're able to get people vaccinated. And so, as you were mentioning, we did hear from the Africa CDC saying that potentially next week we will see vaccinations starting in the DRC, but waiting to hear really the other manufacturers about how they're going to themselves step up and also support in their own ways.
Jen, thank you so much. Bloomberg's chief Africa correspondent, Jennifer Zabazaja. Now let's also speak to Pamela Rendi-Wagner, Director General of the European Centre for Disease Prevention and Control. Pamela, thank you for joining us. I mean, there's still a lot that has to emerge for us to really understand some of the epidemiology and the best way to deal with this. But what does the ECDC actually do at the moment to understand also these new variations, for example, of Clade 1b?
Well, we are constantly, for the past months, monitoring the situation, of course, in Europe, but also beyond. We are in constant coordination and contact with the other CDCs, like in Africa CDC, but also with the United States, in order to have a global picture and a big picture of the developments. And what we can see is a rapid increase of cases in Africa, with a rapid spreading to other countries. So all in all, it's a very unstable and blurred picture right now. in Africa. But what we can expect and must expect actually is more sporadic imported cases to the European continent. So we have to be aware of that. We have to be prepared. The member states, the surveillance systems, the medical facilities have to be prepared. But final sentence to this, it's not the new COVID.
So this is something that I was going to ask you about. Again, when people see a lot of the headlines, they kind of worry that we'll get into something like COVID. Do we have any understanding, Director General, on how these new strains are developed? And are the next 3 to 4 weeks with the first vaccines arriving in the African continent crucial?
Well, from a scientific point of view, I have to tell you that there are many open questions, many unknowns at the moment. And the big thing now for the experts globally is to fill these gaps of knowledge in order to give more precise answers with regard to recommendations, precautionary. This is of utmost importance from the scientific point of view. That's why we are in contact with the member states, of course, with the experts, but also globally in Asia and United States, but most importantly with the African public health authorities, where we have experts also on the ground in Kinshasa.
Yeah, so we also have a number, of course, of reporters I've been following very closely, and they keep on telling me that I guess the big question is also, to what extent can we draw from the knowledge of previous strains of mpox in how we should respond to this new strain? I mean, how difficult, A, is it to get the answers, and when can we expect to have some answers on that?
Well, it's a very important point you're raising, because Europe and globally, we have experience with mpox, because we had an outbreak 2022. It was another clade. It was the clade 2. So up to now, we don't know the precise differences between the current upcoming clade, which is clade 1, compared to clade 2. We don't know really what is the difference, but there is experience, at least for the European member states. I can say that there are surveillance facilities in place. They are monitoring the situation. There are contact tracing facilities, testing and diagnostics in place. And this is most important in order to respond as quickly as possible if there is a sporadic case, in order to avoid a further spreading at the European continent outside Africa.
Is it starting to spread before patients actually show symptoms?
What I can say, we have been, as ECDC, we have been done a new updated risk assessment. And I want to mention that the risk for the European population, the general European population, is low. And this is very important, a very important message for the European people. But what we also know, that there are risk groups, people going to the affected African countries, having close contacts to the African communities, including sexual contacts. They have a moderate risk, so they have a higher risk. And if they have an underlying disease, like immunocompromised people, they have even a high risk. So we have to really raise the awareness for this risk among travelers, and also advise people returning from these countries with suspect symptoms to go as quickly as possible to a healthcare facility to test, in order to avoid further spreading and avoid any people.
Are children more at risk?
Well, this is one of the most important questions we would like to have answered very, very quickly. According to the African data from Africa CDC, we see that the majority of cases are kids below the age of 15. So indeed, it seems to be that this virus is spreading also among the youngest age groups. So we have to be aware of that. If this is also true for a situation in Europe or outside Africa, this is not possible to be answered yet.
Thank you so much for joining us. That was, of course, a very important conversation with Pamela Rendi-Wagner, Director General of the European Centre for Disease Prevention and Control. Coming up, retail results in full swing with Macy's, Target's and TJX all due to report today. The question is, are U.S. shoppers still spending? We'll discuss that next. And this is Bloomberg.
This week, Balance of Power is live in Chicago for the Democratic National Convention.
So we've got a race here, and the sprint begins.
We'll bring you breaking developments.
Vice President Kamala Harris closing the gap with Donald Trump.
And informative analysis, all leading up to special coverage Thursday evening, including Vice President Harris's acceptance speech as the Democratic nominee for president.
As president, I will show Donald Trump what real leadership looks like.
Tune in all week on Bloomberg Television.
The conversations that matter, the insights you need. This is The Pulse, and I'm Francine Lacqua here in London. So don't bet against the U.S. consumer. That, at least, was the conclusion that many drew from last week's retail sales data. But as earnings season continues, we're getting a clearer picture of the health of the American shopper. Now let's bring in Bloomberg's Dasha Afanasieva. Dasha, so you're, of course, a retail expert looking at all of these earnings. There's a bunch of companies in the U.S. reporting. What are traders looking out for?
So they're looking for the strength of the U.S. consumer and what is it that people are willing to spend on and not. And so far what we've seen is they're definitely not spending on DIY and they're definitely not spending on these big ticket items, but they perhaps are looking for good deals. So that's why Walmart actually improved its outlook. So it's all about bargain hunting and promotional activity. I think the other thing that's key when so many retailers and consumer companies are struggling to grow the top line is what are they doing on the bottom line. So I think it's very important to have clarity about productivity savings, about headcount reduction, which is obviously a really sensitive subject. So I think profitability in that environment is in focus.
I mean, at the moment, the market is just trying to get any clues on, the health of the U.S. consumer because they worry about a recession, a Goldilocks scenario, or a soft landing. What are the big retailers in the U.S. that we should be watching out for to really give us an indication of bargain shopping and whether that translates into the economy?
So TJ Maxx is reporting later today. We've already had Walmart. Their Sam's Club sub-brand is doing really, really well. And they're talking about, consumers doing bargain hunting. Beyond that, I guess the Macy's is also reporting today, which I think, that's a different environment. That's not really about the bargain hunting.
Dasha, the other big story is, of course, Walmart. It's one of our most read stories. So it sold its stake in the Chinese firm JD.com. What does it tell us about, I guess, their strategy in China?
So Walmart's actually doing really well in China despite the Chinese slowdown and weak consumer sentiment, and that's because their Sam's Club brand, which is hypermarkets but that operate on a membership basis, which means that people think they're getting this amazing deals. And it's doing really well. They said they had double-digit growth. So it shows that they're pivoting away from this kind of third-party investment, because also JD.com is really fierce online retail competition with the likes of Alibaba and Temu, and they're kind of saying, well, we don't, that it looks like that investment hasn't really panned out as well as you'd hoped. It goes back all the way to 2016, and then the IPO of JD.com came later and is trading down on that, I think largely because of the state of the Chinese consumer. So, playing in China, I guess it's important to have these focused businesses when sentiment is so poor.
So interesting. Dasha, thank you so much for joining us. That was Dasha Afanasieva with the very latest on retail in the U.S. Now, China has launched an anti-subsidy probe on dairy imports from the European Union. It comes after the EU launched additional tariffs on electric cars shipped from Beijing. Well, for more, let's bring in Bloomberg's Oliver Crook in Berlin. Ollie, they're going after the cheese. They're going after the yogurt. How important is this for the rest of the world?
Yeah. Yeah, I know, Francine, this hurts you as much as it hurts me. Cheese both fresh and processed that are being hit by the Chinese now in retaliation to what we saw out of the EU. And really, this is sort of the opening salvo. I should say the second salvo, because they've already opened some investigations into pork. But the question is, what else would they be able to look into, right? Because so these are the two sort of interesting sectors. It's interesting they choose agriculture, Francine, because we know how heavily subsidized the agricultural sector is across Europe and in many countries across the world. So maybe that's sort of seen as low-hanging fruit for them. But we've talked also about spirits, obviously luxury goods. The French are very sort of keen on that, and it's very important to them. But also cars, because we're focused on the EVs coming from China. The Europeans sell some of their highest margin, most expensive big engine ICEs into the Chinese markets from the European market. So that is something that they could target, and it's something that they would hurt the Europeans. If you look at actually the biggest exports to China from Europe, number one is cars, number two is medications, and number three is machinery. So these are all places that they could turn up the pressure. When you look at the actual only categories in which Europe runs a trade surplus with China, it's raw materials and it's food and drink. So these are the things that we really need to pay close attention to. But as we know, Francine, the overall trade balance is really tilted in favor of China. So there's only so much damage they can do without having the Europeans then ratchet it up again and then get a full-blown trade war, which really would hurt China substantially. That's in direct response, Ollie, to the EU's move yesterday on EVs. So what's the latest twist there? Yeah, so we got the latest sort of figures from the EU. They revised some of the tariff figures on each of the individual car makers. I'll give you a sample of some of them to give you an idea of how big they are. So, for example, SAIC has got a 36% tariff. That's really at the top end of the range of these sort of cars that are built in China and shipped into the EU, and the tariffs they'll pay. Geely, which owns Volvo, is up at 19%. BYD, which is really critical, Francine, as we know, because it's the sort of biggest competitor, the biggest player in the EV space, down at 17%, which is high, but really low given the ranges here. And then Tesla at 9% there, because the EU says that basically a lot of these foreign companies that build cars in China and ship them over to Europe actually get a lot fewer subsidies. The Chinese have pushed back against this aggressively, saying that they're strongly dissatisfied and they're firm opposition, and that the reason that their cars are so cheap is because they just have better supply chains and they do business better. So this is going to continue to rumble on until October 30th, when these sort of tariffs are finalized and will last for 5 years. All the earnings out from some key Chinese car companies, how does that fit in? Yeah, so really interestingly, we had the numbers out of Geely just a few hours ago, and they posted really a record profit. They've got really a lot of growth going in terms of their vehicle deliveries, up 41%. It's really interesting because though the Chinese market is slowing down domestically, we've talked a lot about this on Bloomberg, what they're seeing is a lot of export growth. But with a 19% tariff, as Geely is looking at, this could really hit their sort of growth going forward, though they did feel confident enough to revise their expectations higher. You had a very different story over at Xiaopeng in the EV space. That's a pure EV play company. Those earnings came really much lower. What I think is interesting when we talk about the EV market, Francine, is that we look at some of the research out here. Just 19 of the 140 EV companies that exist in China are expected to be profitable by the end of this decade. So with this tariff sort of conversation really amping up the pressure, I think we're going to see a lot more consolidation and failures within that sector. So it's going to be something we're going to be watching very closely over the coming months. Ollie, thanks so much. Oliver Crook there with the very latest on China versus U.S. versus Europe. Now, coming up, we'll have plenty more, of course, on today's top stories, but also the search for missing passengers continues off the coast of Sicily. Among them, the tech entrepreneur Mike Lynch. We'll have an update for you next. This is Bloomberg. In Italy, rescue divers are preparing for a third day in their search and rescue efforts around a sunken yacht off Sicily, where British tech entrepreneur Mike Lynch and Morgan Stanley's Jonathan Bloomer are among those feared dead. Let's bring in Bloomberg's Olivia Solon. Olivia, what's the latest on the search for the missing people?
Right, well, a third day of searching is underway, and there are divers in the water still trying to get into the Bayesian yacht. As far as we're aware, none of the 6 missing people have been found yet. They're believed to be inside the yacht, and authorities at this point are saying that they are unlikely to find any survivors. It's been very difficult to get into the yacht because of so much loose furniture and debris blocking the entry points. And because the vessel is currently about 50 meters underwater, that's quite deep for the divers, and they can only spend small stretches of time working on the yacht before they need to come back up to the surface.
Olivia, do we have a better sense of why the yacht sank?
So there are a lot of questions remaining about this. It's a huge, huge yacht, and it sank within minutes, according to various eyewitnesses we've spoken to. The yacht did have this very large mast. It was this kind of unusual sailing yacht. And the mast itself may have caught the wind, which would have shifted the vessel off balance. But that does not explain why it took on so much water and sank so quickly. I think one of the biggest questions at the moment is whether any of the hatches on the vessel might have been open, which would have allowed the water to enter the vessel and cause it to sink so quickly.
Olivia, Mike Lynch, we understand his family were celebrating his recent acquittal from fraud charges. What do we know about who else was on the boat?
He had a bunch of, it was family and friends and some of his legal team. His 18-year-old daughter Hannah was there, his wife who was rescued. There was his lawyer who involved in his fraud case, Chris Morvillo, and his wife Nada, as well as Morgan Stanley International Bank Chairman Jonathan Bloomer and his wife Judy. Those are the people who remain missing at the moment.
Olivia, thank you so much for the update. We'll have plenty more, of course, on this throughout the day with Olivia, and we'll bring you any breaking news as soon as we have it. Now, this is what else we're watching for today. We do have some U.S. retail earnings. We have Macy's, we have Target and TJX. Then we're hearing from the ECB's Panetta. He's the governor of Banca d'Italia. He's speaking at an event a little bit later. And then a couple of other things. Of course, the big one is not only the Fed minutes at 7 p.m. UK time, but then we go back to the Democratic National Convention with the acceptance speech from Tim Walz. Now, stocks drifting, investors again awaiting this annual review of U.S. jobs data, but also Federal Reserve minutes for further clues on interest rate cuts. So we'll look at the market moves. We'll have all of the very latest on the data with Danny Berggren, Manus Cranny, and Bloomberg Brief. That's next, and this is Bloomberg.